Welcome, everyone. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we work to bring you stories of people who are doing all sorts of interesting things in the world, especially things that align with our sense of possibility associated with the Rotary motto, which is service above self. Our club, the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, is a club that has a special interest in education, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And when those things come together in really interesting ways, we end up with some really fine talks. And today, we are very happy to have with us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard, Dr. Eric Mazur. Dr. Mazur and I have known each other for about 10 years. We have had the chance to share ideas on possibilities with teaching. His work, and especially his lecture, Confessions of a Converted Lecturer, were very important for me and how I think about the work that I do. And so it is with a lot of enthusiasm that I am excited to present to you today Dr. Eric Mazur. Eric, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. We're excited to have you.
Rushton, I'm just as excited as you are and honored to be here. And thank you for the invitation. I'm going to take you on a little whirlwind tour, and I have some slides to share with you, so I'll put them up here. I joined Harvard almost 40 years ago in January 1982 and started teaching there in the fall of 1984, so after being there for about 2 years. And when I started teaching, I had never really thought about how to best teach, so I simply did what my professors had done to me, lecture. In fact, here's a picture of me teaching my class, Introductory Physics for pre-meds and engineers. These are not students who want to learn physics. No, they already dread physics the day they come into the classroom. Now, the reason I lectured was because that's the only thing I knew. That's what my professors had done to me. And I think that we all tend to do that. We tend to project our own experiences on the world around us. And I'm sure that my professors, when they started teaching, made exactly the same assumption. They had been taught by professors who lectured them, and they simply followed their example. Generation after generation after generation, all the way back to this person here. This is Henry VIII, King of Germany, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, giving a guest lecture at the University of Bologna in the 12th century. This is actually an illustration from an illuminated manuscript from the 14th century. And you only need to glance at this picture to see the uncanny similarity between the picture that I showed you before. Was granted, it's from BC, this picture, before computers. You see, I'm using an overhead projector there, and this illustration, which is not quite 1,000 years, but pretty close to 1,000 years earlier. You can see the students in the front row, pardon me, pay close attention. They look a little bit more bored in the back. Here in the corner, they're having a conversation with each other. And here in front, there's this person who is either fast asleep or cringing in agony. I don't know. We no longer wear these robes while we're teaching. We still wear them on graduation to remind ourselves that we're steeped in medieval traditions. But other than that, I mean, there's an uncanny resemblance between these two scenes. Now, what happened was that my students really liked me as a lecturer, and they gave me really high ratings. And they also did well on what I considered complicated exams. So I very quickly started to think that I was actually very successful at teaching. And because most of my colleagues would get very poor evaluation for this physics course for non-majors, I very quickly started to believe that I was the world's best physics teacher. Now, that turned out to be a complete illusion, a house of cards, if you want. Yes, they were giving me high evaluations for my teaching. And yes, they were doing well on what I consider difficult exams, but they were simply memorizing by rote rather than learning about the process of science and how to think like a scientist. And it took actually many years before I realized that the lecture actually simply focuses on the transfer of information, which most students then simply memorize and regurgitate on an exam at the end of the year, not really internalizing the information. That led me in the early 90s to completely change my approach to teaching and make it completely interactive using an approach I ended up calling peer instruction, because students teach each other in small discussion groups. I showed that I could triple the learning gains using over the lecture method using that approach, and that this internalizing the information led to better retention of knowledge and skills. When I published my book on peer instruction, you can see the cover there in the back, the method took off, and now you can find tens of thousands of articles in many different fields and in many different educational settings, showing about the success of peer instruction, which then later gave rise to the flipped classroom movement and other forms of interactive teaching. Over the next, almost 30 years, I ended up greatly changing my approach, even further beyond the interactive teaching that I just alluded to. So when the pandemic hit in March 2020, I was teaching a course in this classroom here to a group of about 80 undergraduate students, engineers and life science students. Let me tell you a little bit about that course and then tell you the effect that the pandemic had on my teaching. The course is, first of all, team-based. Students work in teams in order to learn better how to collaborate with others. After all, these are becoming engineers, they're becoming doctors, they'll be working in teams. And if anything, education is completely focused on the individual, whereas real life tends to be focused on people working together. What are the biggest problems in society? People not being able to work with each other. Small wonder, because we never really teach them, which is why I incorporate this team-based learning in my course. But more important than that, it's project-based. Rather than giving my students the textbook and saying, here, learn this, it's good for you, which sounds a little bit like your mother telling you, eat your spinach because it's good for you. I put the content aside, the textbook aside, and I tell my students, we're going to work on some exciting projects. And I try to add a component of empathy or social good. And when the students are really excited about the project, I tell them, here, you may want to have a look at this textbook. It may help you with your project. So the content, physics in my case, rather than being an abstract goal in its own right, becomes a means, a vehicle to accomplish a goal that's much more meaningful in the eyes of the students. The whole purpose is to increase the students' intrinsic motivation, to make the learning fun again, to bring smiles back on the faces of the students. We tend to forget that learning is something that is not confined to schools and universities, that living is learning, and that learning basically needs to be fun in order to really stick. As I showed in this picture, not only did I change the format of the course, I also completely changed the learning space. It's round tables, students working together, boards. There's not even any option to lecture in a classroom like that. So there are no lectures. And what's more, and I could talk about this at length, but I won't, there are no examinations. There's assessment, obviously, but no high stakes assessment where a single failure can pull you down irrevocably. So then came March 13th, 2020, and we had a few days to leave campus, and my students were spread out over the globe because we have a very diverse student body. And I had students in South Korea and Bahrain, in Latin America, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in Europe. I mean, they were literally spread over the globe. And one of the things I discovered was that this team-based approach and this this project-based approach actually translated remarkably well to an online setting. In fact, pardon me, I think I accidentally closed my slides. Let me open them. In fact, when the university, at the end of that semester, that first semester that was half in person and half online, asked the student, was there an instructional continuity between the first half of the semester and the second half of the semester? 86% of the students agreed that there had been a continuity, 60% of them strongly so. So that gave me the courage in the summer of 2020 to actually completely rethink and reimagine my course. Essentially, what I'd done in the rapid transition during that spring semester last year was to ask myself, how can I transfer online what I do in the classroom? But in that case, you actually see the transition as a challenge and not as an opportunity. So during the summer, I decided to change the question I asked myself and ask myself, what can I do online that I cannot do in the classroom? And it turns out I could actually implement quite a few changes. First of all, I decided to minimize any synchronous and instructor-based activity. You see, by virtue of the physical classroom, most instruction around the globe is synchronous. You have to all be together in that classroom at the same time, dictated by the availability of the classroom for the course. But once you don't have a physical classroom anymore, you can make things asynchronous and let students participate in the learning process when it works for them. In fact, in my case, I had to do that because of the large, diversity of time zones my students were in. But what's more, most instruction traditionally tends to be instructor-paced. It's the instructor who sets the pace at which the students are taken through the materials. But as we know, learning isn't something that takes place at a fixed pace. At some point, some students learn faster. At some other point, some others learn faster. So the more you can make the instruction asynchronous and student-paced, the more you match the needs of the learner rather than what the instructor can do. The other thing is I started to think about personalizing the instruction. For example, in standard instruction, the students have to come to the instructor space, the classroom. I decided to invert that. Since it was a team-based course, I had each little team create its own Zoom room. And rather than having the students come to my room, I would go and visit the students' Zoom room whenever they needed me. The inverse of what you typically do. And finally, I decided to completely change the assessment in my classroom. And rather than relying on a few high-stakes assessments, I decided to adopt an approach called specifications grading, where essentially I held the students continuously accountable for little bits in the courses. In fact, I split up the entire course in close to 70 different small micro units. And each time they pass one of these micro units, they get a badge. And at the end, the grade is determined by the number of badges that they have accumulated. And if they miss one unit, they can always redo it. So in a sense, it forces the students continuously to be on the top and to focus more on the feedback than on a grade. It was truly transformative. And in fact, I, as a physicist, very much value data. So I decided to actually use this as an opportunity to collect data, and I'm going to show you a few. In the fall, the content learning gain doubled. So this was the in-person semester the year before, and here's the gain in the remote semester. As you can see, it doubled. In the spring, again, nearly a doubling. But it was not only the content learning gains that doubled. I found another huge gain in self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is one's belief in their ability to succeed in a certain domain. And typically, if you ask engineering or life science students, you know, about their self-efficacy in physics, they tend to score low. And interestingly enough, in standard lecture-based courses, that self-efficacy goes down over the course of the year. In other words, at the end of the year, even though they may have earned a high grade, their belief in being able to succeed in physics goes down, in part because the lecture method is just not very effective at promoting this self-efficacy. When I switched to interactive teaching, the self-efficacy remained the same, at least it didn't go down. And when I teach the project-based course, it went up a tiny little bit. But what we found after the transition online and making those 3 changes that I just highlighted to you, we found that the self-efficacy actually doubled just as the content learning gains doubled. So a doubling of content learning gains, a doubling of physics self-efficacy gains. And not just that, other testing showed that students' sense of growth and autonomy increased. In other words, they had more of a sense of growing intellectually in the course, and they have more of a sense of owing that growth to themselves rather than the teacher. In addition to that, because of the format of the course, in spite of being online and on Zoom, they expressed a very large increased sense of support and, can you believe this, community. In part, maybe because this didn't feel like a large introductory class with 80 students, but rather a small 4-person class because they mostly met in their Zoom team rooms, and then somebody from the teaching team would meet them. The course evaluation shot up. In fact, I got a 4.9 out of 5 at the end of the semester, which I typically don't get for an introductory course for non-majors. I get that for majors, but not for non-majors. And as a consequence, I'm paying the price right now because the course grew by more than 50% this fall. So I think it's no overstatement to say that I did my best teaching ever during the pandemic. So over the summer, I was thinking, now what? The administration was insisting that I teach in person. And it's true, during the year that we taught online, I'd missed building together in our maker spaces, seeing the students working on their projects, and then during the project fairs, all getting together. But should I just simply revert back? What I ended up doing, and it's too early to tell how well it's working because we're just 3 weeks into the semester, is actually to adopt a multimodal approach. Students still work in the same format, same teams, same type of 4-person teams, but they get a choice. They can either come to the classroom and I meet with them in person, or they can meet on Zoom and I'll join them on Zoom. In fact, since my office is just below the classroom, I run back and forth between the classroom to join a team in person, and then back down to my office to join a team on Zoom. An interesting trend I've observed is that over the course of these first 3 weeks of the semester, more teams have decided that Zoom is actually more conducive for them to work together than in person. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this year will pan out. And one thing I can say with certainty, my teaching will never completely revert back to what it was before. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eric. That is a wonderful set of ideas to build from, and I am excited for us to have the chance to do it. Let me introduce the others on the call. So my name is Rushton Hurley. I'm the programs chair for the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, and also with us is Rory Olson, a judge and a mediator in Texas, and a good buddy. So we are excited to talk to you a little bit about this. I'm going to open this with a question about how we look at what we do. So when we think about the idea of teaching, or when we think about the idea of having a group of people dedicated to service, we inherit methods of doing these things. This is what I experienced, so this is what I expect. And one of the things that I love about your work is the willingness to stop and say, is that really what we should be doing? And so your interest, for example, in the possibilities of online and asynchronous teaching in some ways mirrors our work as a Rotary club, as an online and asynchronous club. But as I think about the different pieces, there are two things that come forward that I think apply in both settings. One is that by making learning more active and getting people to talk together a lot more, they are far more likely to deal honestly with their lack of omniscience, right? Kind of a sense of, I don't know this and I need to ask, which of course accelerates learning in all sorts of ways. Because if you're like, well, I don't want people to know I don't know, then that slows lots of things down. I would think, and I'm curious, and I'm finally getting to my question. I would think, and I'm curious whether this is part of your experience, that people in a lot of different professional settings have found that these ideas resonate. Have you talked with people in a lot of different kinds of professional settings about your work with regard to communication and learning?
Absolutely, Rushton. Thank you. This is just a great question, and I think it all comes down to the point that learning is learning, right? No matter what the context or the subject. I remember that I was once asked to speak in front of an audience of corporate trainers, including people who for airlines do training for flight attendants and pursers, or people who do chemical safety in industrial plants. And I was thinking, what do I have to tell these people? As a Harvard professor teaching physics, so I was initially a little bit reluctant, and I thought, this is going to go nowhere. But I gave my talk, and it was met with an incredible enthusiasm. And then I realized, if you're training flight attendant, the basic goal is to make flying safer. And yes, you can just teach flight attendant to act by rote. If this happens, then do that. And if this light goes on, do that. And if there's a fire there, do this. But in any real emergency, it's going to be different from what is in the manual. And ultimately, you need to create thinking individuals who can take decisions and act, given circumstances that might be not completely clear. So it's all really about not memorizing things, but about thinking, about the thought process. And I realized that the interactive teaching actually brings this thought process back into the classroom. And therefore, whether you're a nurse in an emergency room or a corporate trainer or a flight attendant, it's relevant in all of these circumstances.
Fantastic. Roy, I believe you have a question. And you're muted. So Roy, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Okay. Anyway, yeah, Doctor, when you mentioned about students not really wanting to learn, that reminded me when I was an undergraduate, I had a professor of political science whose family was well known. Indeed, they were one of the ruling houses of Europe before World War I was over. So when the war was over, he pursued his education, and then he went to work as a minister in the Czech government, which lasted until Hitler came. So when he and his family moved out of Czechoslovakia very rapidly, they said, we have found, this is the Vatican, we have found a university where you can teach. And they said, what language can you teach? And he said, he spoke 4 languages because he'd been a diplomat, and they said, German's your native language. Come to the United States and teach. So they move him to the United States, and they say, well, the summer's coming up, so the only course we're going to have is a course for pre-med students where they're going to learn German. And he said, well, it's my native language, but, my doctorate is from the Sorbonne, and, I haven't really studied it. And they said, you do not understand. They're there because medical school requires that they have some German, but they don't really want to learn because nobody in the class most probably is going to go into research where they have to translate something from Deutsch to English. And he said after teaching that class for 2 summers, he was convinced nobody ever going to learn anything. Yeah.
Well, that resonates with me, and I think education still has a long way to go, and it's not just what matters. And I sort of alluded to that in my remarks. What matters is not only how we teach, but also how we assess learning and how we assess the teaching. Right? Typically, learning is assessed by high stakes examination that students simply have to pass in order to move on to the next step in education. And I think my research and that of others has shown that many students can pass the examination without really having any firm understanding of what's below. And how is teaching evaluated? Well, by asking the students, how much did you like this course? Which is not really a metric of how much you've learned, which what it should be in the first place. So we have a long way to go, but I think that the pandemic has created a certain amount of momentum and impetus that is pushing us further into the right direction.
So go ahead, Roy.
I was just going to say, I taught a semester at the University of Houston. I was in a specialized class in guardianship law. And when the semester was over, I went back and the students went and took the bar exam. And about 2 years later, I got a call from one of my former students who asked me a question, which obviously I answered. But the strange thing was, she took the course. She passed the course. If she just pulled out her coat and read it, she would didn't need to ask me. And when you mentioned the self-efficacy, that reminded me of it, that whatever else I did, I probably didn't instill enough sense of self-efficacy, but she should have been able to answer her own question.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that realm, I'd like to look at an element of the title of the talk, the moral dilemma of going back. And so Rotary has a code of ethics that begins, it's 4 pieces that start with, is it the truth? And one of the things that is in your confessions talk available on YouTube, we'll get the link on that for everyone who might be watching the recording to follow it if interested. And then also in the talk you've just given, the truth is that you were seeing strong reasons to do something different. And in the face, for example, of the Harvard administration saying, all right, we're moving back to in-person. And you're thinking, we made a lot of gains doing this online. That represents a dilemma of, do you speak up? How many people will agree? How do they talk about it? How do you debate the issue of how to go back? Did you find that there were some really interesting insights from colleagues at Harvard about this question of whether to go back to in-person teaching?
So I took my decision to do what I'm doing this semester before there was a really strong official announcement from the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. I decided not to ask for permission to do what I'm doing. I just did it because, I had the data. I thought if I ask for permission, then I have to go to the classroom, and I cannot even offer my students a choice. And in fact, what is happening right now on campus, makes me feel even more strongly that I took the right decisions. A lot of students have to go into quarantine because they were exposed. They either test positive or they were exposed to somebody who tests positive. So in my class right now, I have a handful of students who are not able to come to class. That's no problem in the format that we're teaching. It's absolutely no problem. They're complaining that for the other classes they're taking, there is no such option. They're falling behind. And it's a significant fraction of the, well, it's maybe not significant fraction. It's not an insignificant fraction, double negative there, of students. So I think I can accommodate them much better. Plus, I know that their learning is not damaged by doing what I'm doing. So I think I'm going sort of under the radar screen, and in any case, if they want to fire me, they can fire me. That's fine. My goal is not to please the administration. My goal is to do what is best for my students.
Well, as that is quite a punchline. I think what I'll do is I'll recognize that we're running out of time. I'll save a question for after we stop the recording. But for all of you who have been watching this recording, thank you so much for joining us. The Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley wants people all over the world to find inspiration in wonderful ideas, in innovative service, and in the efficacy of understanding that you can make a difference in the lives of others. We hope that you will let us know that you are a part of this by filling out the little form of attendance that's below this recording. And then also, a little farther down, you'll see our forum for discussion. Discuss with a Q. And let us know what you think. Let us know what you think of the content of the meeting, what you think of the content of this program, and feel free to reply to others who have tossed out ideas as well. It's one of the ways that we as an online asynchronous club get a chance to share our ideas with each other. As we always like to do, we hand it back to the speaker for a final word. So Eric, I hand it back to you for the final word.
Well, first of all, Rushton, I want to thank you for inviting me. It was a great opportunity actually to reflect on what I'm doing, and I think reflection is very important, and that's another aspect that is really missing in education, right? Because formal education doesn't stop when we give our students their diplomas, it continues. And the only way to continue to grow is to be able to assess yourself and to reflect on your own accomplishment. So I hope that anybody who is involved in teaching of any kind will consider embedding reflection and student thinking about their own learning into their approaches to teaching. And certainly, the opportunity to speak here has given me an opportunity to reflect on my own teaching. So thank you for that.
We thank you. And for all of you who've been watching, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.